I'm Stacy. Welcome to the kitchen of my old Kentucky home. Today on Bourbon and Biscuits, we're going to be making two sweet holiday traditions, a Kentucky jam cake and hot buttered bourbon. Let's get started. Here's what we'll need for our Kentucky jam cake. 3 cups of flour, 1 cup of butter, 1 cup of blackberry preserves, 1 cup of brown sugar, 1 cup of table sugar, 4 eggs, 1 cup of black walnuts, a half a cup of sour cream, a 1/4 cup of Kentucky bourbon, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, a half a teaspoon of nutmeg, and a half a teaspoon of cloves. We are going to make this Kentucky jam cake from scratch. I like to use a stand-up mixer, but you can also use a handheld mixer. The first thing we're going to do is cream together our butter that I've had softened on the counter for over an hour and our 2 sugars. I'm going to let that get mixed up, and we're going to add our eggs, which I have already beaten. I've used 4 large eggs. I've seen a lot of recipes for 5 or 6, but I would assume those would be smaller eggs. This concoction has creamed up pretty nicely. It's kind of light and fluffy, is what we want it to be. And we're just going to add the eggs now. Give that a mix. While that's going, I'm going to grab my flour, which I have already sifted. And again, you can use a sifter or the colander like we do. I'm just going to start adding the rest of these ingredients. This is one of my favorite holiday treats. You can eat it all year, of course, but it's great when your cousin Brenda brings it to the holiday festivities. Okay, while this is mixing, you can go on and add some of your spices. I have a half a teaspoon of cloves. A lot of different recipes and old Kentucky cookbooks call for a whole teaspoon. That's not quite to my taste profile that I like, so I have that. Did the same with the nutmeg, but if you are a big fan of those baking spices, by all means, up the quantity on that. And of course, everybody loves cinnamon, right? So I kept the whole teaspoon of cinnamon. Okay, that's looking good and smelling good. All right, I think those baking spices have mixed in. So now for the good part, we're gonna take our 1/4 cup of Kentucky bourbon. I used Wild Turkey for this, the 101 proof. It's for the holidays, right? And I've got my teaspoon of baking soda, and I'm just going to pour it here in this bourbon and let that dissolve. And then we're gonna pour this whole thing right into our batter. Put that out of there. We're also gonna add our half a cup of sour cream. Buttermilk can be used for this. I would do about equal parts. To give it I even saw in a really old cookbook, sour milk. It's from the early 1900s. We're gonna give that a mix. Then our final ingredient before we just do a little stirring is gonna be adding our preserves. Now, Kentucky jam cake can be made out of any preserves. I've seen strawberry, peach, but my favorite and probably the most traditional is blackberry. So these are this 1 cup of blackberry preserves. And if I were a really good Kentucky cook, I would have been using the ones that we'd put up in the summer, but we didn't put up any preserves this summer. I'll put that on our bucket list for next summer. Okay, we're gonna mix this in. And then the final thing I'm gonna do, I've already added some flour to coat these black walnuts. This keeps them from sinking to the bottom of the cake. And once this gets mixed in, we're just gonna add these and stir these in before we put them in our cake pans. I want it all the same color, and it's starting to turn a hint of purple in this cake batter. It's really pretty. Now your preserves are still going to be, I don't know if you can see this on camera or not, you know, they're gonna sometimes be in little concentrations like that, that's quite all right. That was going to be one tasty bite. Okay, and then this last step is going to be adding these nuts. Now this is totally optional. If you have family members or friends with nut allergies, you don't have to add the nuts. You can also substitute for pecans if you want that. This is very traditional Kentucky black walnut. You know, the reason I think that the traditional ingredients in this recipe are the blackberry preserves and the black walnuts is simply because they were so abundant in Kentucky, and you know, good Kentuckians like to be resourceful, and so it was something they celebrated during the holidays. All right, we have our 3 filled cake pans with this beautiful Kentucky jam cake batter, and we're gonna pop those in a 325-degree oven for 40 minutes. Okay, this kitchen smells great right now. This is one of the cake pans fresh out of the oven. While we let that cool, we're gonna whip up a caramel icing, which we will put the recipe online. You can also cheat and buy your own. And I'm gonna get that cake set up while Jessica makes us some hot buttered bourbon.
Today we're gonna make a really comforting winter cocktail. We're gonna do a hot buttered bourbon. And actually this is a great cocktail to make while you're baking because you've probably got most of the ingredients out already. We're gonna use just a tablespoon of butter, a teaspoon of brown sugar, plus a dash of cinnamon, nutmeg, and allspice. And then we're gonna do a dash of vanilla also. So all we're gonna do here is we're gonna muddle together the butter with our spices. And you can also do this in a larger batch. What we call this part of this is the batter in the cocktail. And you can make the batter ahead of time and you can store it in a log or just put it back in the refrigerator, and that'll last a little while. So then all you have to do is add your bourbon and your hot water. All right, make kind of a paste out of this. All right, so once we get all of the butter nicely incorporated with the sugar and the spices, we are just going to skip off our muddler here a little bit and then add in our bourbon. We're gonna be using today 2 ounces of Kentucky Peerless. And then we're gonna top this off with hot water. You don't want your water to be at boiling point. You don't want it to be that hot, but you do want it to be pretty warm still. And then you wanna give this a really good stir to get everything melted and incorporated together. All right, so once you get everything really well blended in there together, you can really smell all those nice baking spices. And so here we have a hot buttered bourbon. So as soon as I walked in, I thought the kitchen smelled amazing and it smells like the holidays.
Doesn't it?
Yes.
It really, I have to say, it took me back to my grandmother's kitchen. It really did. I've also got to say that I now know why she rolled it out for special occasions.
Sure.
The actual making of the cake is literally a piece of cake. Mm-hmm. It's the caramel icing. And of course you can buy store-bought and make it easier for yourself. And we'll have the recipe online. Whipping it up, no problem.
It became a 2-man job at the end, but we got there.
No kidding. I think we did a pretty good job, though.
We did. I think it looks great.
Yeah.
It tastes amazing. It tastes just like my grandma's icing did on her caramel cakes.
I'm so glad. You know, this is such a traditional Kentucky recipe. And again, it's one of those things. I thought it was more like maybe pimento cheese, just a southern
like
thing.
A regional.
Right. And when you grow up, you don't know these things, right? I thought everybody had jam cake, but apparently it is very much a Kentucky thing. Some parts of Tennessee also had recipes, but those antique cookbooks that I have, this was a riff on my grandmother Fanny Pryor's recipe, but I found it in almost every Kentucky cookbook that I have, going back to late 1800s. Yeah. And that's where you see like sour milk instead of the sour cream or even the buttermilk.
I will say that you don't really see it on all that many menus around town or even in that many bakeries.
You're right, you don't. There was a famous restaurant for years. In fact, I went to my prom there. It's been a long time. Hassenauer's, and that was their signature dessert. But it's kind of fallen off of just like stack cake.
I really don't understand why.
But there is one place you can always get it. Do you know that place in Smoketown?
No.
Shirley Mays.
Oh, yeah.
I think she is in her 80s now.
Really?
And still makes it from scratch, has it every day along
I'm
with that
new to
fried
her
chicken.
for her fried chicken.
Right.
Yeah.
So now if you can't get to Louisville and go to Shirley Mays, you can at least whip this Kentucky tradition up at home. And speaking of traditions, I usually have this with rum, right?
Yeah, so most people you'd see it hot buttered rum, that's more well known, but even with that you're going to be using an aged rum. So it's going to have a lot of the same characteristics as bourbon since it's going to be a barrel aged spirit. And then when you've got the extra like baking spices and stuff in there, it pairs great with bourbon.
It really did. And what a great thing to batch for the
Yeah,
holidays,
you
right?
could just leave kind of like a log of the butter and the spice all together, slice that off and add your whiskey and your hot water and serve it to guests as soon as they come over. So it's great.
It's awesome. Two great recipes to celebrate Kentucky holidays and entertaining.
Yeah, cheers to that, and we'll see you next time on Bourbon
And biscuits.